Hello, New Life children. It's Pastor Carmen, and I miss you, and I want to share a story with you. This is the desert. It's not the whole desert, it's just a piece of the desert, because the desert is so important to the story of God and God's people that we need to have a little bit of it here in our Godly Play materials. This isn't your Godly Play classroom, but this is your desert bag, and you will be back hearing stories soon at New Life. The desert can be a dangerous place. The wind blows the valleys into mountains and the mountains into valleys, and you can get lost. People can lose their way, and there's very little to eat or to drink because there's almost no rain or water. The wind blows so hard it can sting your skin with the sand, and the sun can burn, and at night it can be very cold. The desert is a dangerous place, and people don't go into the desert unless they have to. It takes courage to go into the desert. After the flood, the people and the animals went out into the four corners of the earth and began to live again. The people began to live in little towns, which grew into cities, and many of those were along the great rivers where there was water, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And the small towns grew into cities, and one of the greatest of those ancient cities was Ur. In Ur, people believed that there was a god of the water and a god of the sand and a god of the sky and the stars and the flowers and the plants. The world was alive with gods. One family was beginning to believe that maybe there was one God that was in everything. They didn't know that for sure yet, but that was what they were beginning to believe. Abram and Sarai were part of that family. When it came time to leave Ur, they wondered if God would be there in the new places too. They set out on their journey with their tents, their sheep, and all the old people and the young people, and they followed the river so they would have water and know which way to go. It was a long journey, and when they finally started to see people coming the other way, they knew that they were almost there. And then they were there. Abram would sometimes go out to the edge of the desert and look out over the sand into the sky, and God would come so close to Abram, and Abram would come so close to God that Abram knew what God wanted. God told Abram to go farther out into the desert. Abram's nephew Lot went with them this time, and they went out. And this time there was no river to guide them. They came to a place called Shechem. And Abram climbed a hill and prayed and found that God was there too. So they built an altar at that place to mark it, and they continued their journey. They came to a place called Bethel, and again Abram went out and prayed and found that God was there too. And so they built an altar to mark that place. And they continued their journey, and they came at last to the oaks at Mamre near Hebron, and there they made their home. Abram would still go out into the desert, and God would come so close to Abram, and Abram would come so close to God that Abram knew what God was saying. God told Abram that he would become the father of a great family, and Sarai would be the mother. Abram laughed. They were too old. They didn't have any children. But God told them that their children would number the number of grains of sand in the desert and the number of stars in the sky. And God told them to change their names. Abram was to become Abraham, and Sarai was to become Sarah. And so they did. And one day, Abram was sitting in his tent and saw 3 strangers approach out of the desert. And he told Sarah to make bread from 3 measures of flour, which is a lot. And when the guests came, they served them milk and water and meat and bread, as was their custom. And the strangers told Abraham that Sarah would have a child. Sarah, standing outside the tent, heard this and laughed. She was too old. Abraham was too old. The strangers went on their way, and do you know what happened? They had a child. And this time they laughed for joy, and they named him Isaac, which in their language is the word for laughter. Isaac grew up, and when he was grown, Sarah, who was very old and full of years, died and was buried near the oaks at Mamre. Abraham was sad and lonely, but he knew he had one more thing to do. He needed to find a wife for Isaac. So he sent his most trusted servant back to the land where his people lived. And when the servant arrived at a well there, he met a young woman named Rebecca. She was as courageous as she was kind, and she offered him water and water for all of his animals. She took him home to meet her family, and the servant told them about the great family out in the desert, and Rebecca decided that she would like to become part of that great family. And so she returned with the servant past Shechem and Bethel. And when they had almost reached Haran, Isaac saw them and came running to meet her. In time, they were married. And Abraham, now very old and full of years, died and was buried near Sarah, near the oaks of Mamre, in a cave there. Isaac and Rebekah had children, and their children had children, and their children had children, and that went on until your grandparents had your parents, and your parents had you. And now you are part of this great family that numbers the grains of sand in the desert and the number of stars in the sky. We are part of that great family. And there's a lot of wondering to do about this story. I hope you'll wonder about it with your parents at home. I wonder where you are in this story, or what part is especially about you. I wonder if there's any part of this story that we could take out and still have all the story we need. I wonder what the most important part of this story is. I wonder if today, I'm wondering if this is part of our story. I have loved walking on this journey with you as your pastor. And now it's time for me to go to a new place. And for you to lead new life into new adventures and new ways of serving God and our neighbors. And I know that wherever we go, God will be there too.